of the most horrifying scientific experiments in human history. The first experiment took place in 1929. In that year, humanity was still developing telephones and sound transmission technology. Their goal was to connect distant lands, but primarily to transmit information as quickly as possible to support warfare. You couldn't send a message to the army and wait a month for them to receive it, or another month for them to arrive. Therefore, research into telephones and sound transmission technology became widespread among scientists at that time. And among them, two names left a lasting impression in the scientific community, not because of their talent, but because of the madness in their experiments. These were two scientists named Ernest Glenn Wever and Charles W. Bray. They wondered, and then they actually did it. They chose a cat for the experiment. In the lab, two scientists surgically removed part of the cat's head. They detached a section of the skull and attached electrodes directly into its right auditory nerve. Then, the entire system was connected to a nearly 15-meter long cable leading to a speaker in another soundproof room. Their idea was simple. Someone would speak into the cat's ear. The sound would be converted into nerve signals, and the electrode system would transmit those signals to the speaker in the next room. Sounds like science fiction, right? But the scary thing is, it actually worked. According to records from the time, sound was transmitted clearly. Content was fully understood. In other words, the cat became a living telephone. Today, when people reread this experiment, many not only find it horrifying, but also extremely disturbing. At that time, ethical regulations in animal research were virtually non-existent. There were no animal protection associations. There were no strict humane standards, and the scientific community was willing to try almost anything as long as it helped them get closer to new discoveries. Even stranger, after the test subject died, they tried to repeat the process, but failed. The signals could no longer be transmitted, and that's when they realized something terrifying. Only living organisms can complete this signal transmission. Today, Wever's and Bray's experiment is still mentioned as one of the strangest and most controversial studies of the early 20th century, because it raises a question that sends chills down many people's spines. With science developing so rapidly, will there come a time when humans begin to view living organisms as tools?
Next, we'll move on to an experiment that challenges all of humanity. In the 1960s, behaviorist John B. Calhoun conducted an experiment to answer the question, if living in a world with no food shortages, no predators, no disease, and no war, could any organism other than humans build a perfect society? Calhoun created a special environment for mice. He called it Universe 25. It was a nearly perfect cage with unlimited food, ample water, a stable temperature, and no predators. In other words, it was a paradise for mice. Initially, he released 4 pairs of healthy mice into it, and everything went extremely well. In the early stages, the rat population reproduced rapidly. They build territories, they establish social order, they care for their young. Everything works almost perfectly. The population increases steadily, from 8 to 16, then to 50 and 100, until things start to spiral out of control. When the number of mice reaches 100, space begins to become cramped. Young mice no longer have a clear social position. They are jostled, attacked, and isolated. And then the entire mouse society begins to collapse. Calhoun calls this phenomenon behavioral sink. Strange behaviors begin to appear in the mouse colony. Mice fight for no reason, bite and tear each other, cannibalize each other. Mothers abandon or kill their own offspring. Social skills gradually disappear. But most terrifying of all was the appearance of a strange group of rats. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. They neither fought nor mated. They didn't care about territorial disputes. They simply ate, slept, and groomed themselves all day. Their fur was perfect, their bodies were excessively clean, but inside, almost all social instincts had vanished. They abandoned the idea of surviving as a community. They existed only as isolated individuals. Then the unthinkable happened. Despite ample food, plenty of water, no disease, and no war, the rat population began to die out. The birth rate dropped to 0. Almost all the baby rats died. The adults lost the ability to care for and interact with each other. Finally, Universe 25 died slowly in silence. What made this experiment famous wasn't just the mice, but Calhoun's conclusion. He believed that a society cannot survive solely by meeting material needs. When organisms lose their social roles, community connections, and sense of being needed, their collapse begins from within. To this day, Universe 25 remains one of the most haunting experiments in scientific history. Many look at it and wonder, is this just a story about mice, or is it a warning to humanity? The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by psychologist Philip Zimbardo in 1971, attracted many participants because it was a paid experiment. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to answer a question. What would happen if ordinary people were given absolute power? To test this, he transformed the basement of Stanford University into a simulated prison. 24 healthy, psychologically sound students were recruited. They were then divided into 2 groups, prisoners and guards. Initially, everyone thought it was just a harmless role-playing game. They were wrong. The prisoners were dressed in uniforms, called by numbers instead of names, had their sleep schedules controlled, and had to ask permission for every activity. Meanwhile, the guards were given almost absolute control. And then things started to spiral out of control incredibly quickly. In less than 24 hours, the guards began to become cruel. They insulted the prisoners, forced them to do push-ups in the middle of the night, humiliated them, isolated them, and punished them senselessly. The most terrifying thing was that no one forced them to do this. There was no script, no instructions to be violent. Ordinary students spontaneously began to behave like people with absolute power. Meanwhile, many of the prisoners began to experience psychological breakdowns. They started crying, panicking, losing control of their emotions, and even showing signs of genuine trauma. Some forgot that this was just an experiment. They began to believe they were truly prisoners. The terrifying thing was that even Philip Zimbardo gradually became engrossed in his role as chief warden. He didn't stop the experiment immediately, even though things had become extremely dangerous. Ultimately, the experiment, originally planned to last 2 weeks, had to be stopped after only 6 days because it had turned into a real psychological nightmare. To this day, the Stanford Prison Experiment remains one of the world's most famous and controversial studies. Some see it as evidence that power and environment can transform ordinary people into ruthless individuals in a short period of time. Others argue that the experiment itself was unethical and heavily manipulated. But whether right or wrong, one thing sends chills down many people's spines after learning about the study. Perhaps the terrifying monster doesn't lie most in the shadows, but within each person who believes they possess absolute power. The experiments we just witnessed weren't just frightening because of their bizarre images or haunting results. They revealed a very real truth. Science itself is neither good nor bad. What determines that is always humanity. A scientist can use their knowledge to save millions of lives, but that same knowledge can also turn living organisms into cold, emotionless experimental tools. And what's most thought-provoking is that most of those conducting these studies don't see themselves as villains. They believe they are serving science, advancing humanity, or creating a better future.